Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today, both those of you who are in the room and those of you who are tuning in online. We're looking forward to this next session, which will be on the power of inclusion, designing equitable energy systems across social divisions. This event is co-organized by CCG, Climate Compatible Growth, and GESI, Gender Equality and Social Inclusion. CCG is funded by the FCDO, UK's Foreign Commonwealth Development Office.
If you wish to ask a question at all throughout the event, please use Slido. The link is www.slido.com and the code is 2715656. I'll now introduce to you the chair of today's session, Makena Ireri. She is the Director of Clean Energy Access Research at CLASP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. As Erin said, I'm the Director of Clean Energy Access at CLASP. CLASP is an organization that focuses on energy efficiency and energy efficiency of appliances specifically, and how those go towards development, especially social and economic development. So today, I think I have a really amazing panel, but before I introduce you to the panel, I'd like to maybe set the scene a little bit, right? Why social inclusion for energy access systems, or energy systems, and why should we be having this conversation now? So, inclusion is really important, and it's really undervalued because as part of an equitable energy transition, we really can't leave some people behind, right? We have to take everyone along with us. And that's the idea of social inclusion. And we're talking about several dimensions here, not just gender, but all the other ways that society can indeed exclude portions of our society. And it's really vital for us to go beyond sustainability, and in the build-up for climate compatible growth, it's really important that we include ideas of equity. Sorry, just give me a minute here. Small print. So in this session, we'll look at inclusivity in energy transitions. We'll talk from people from different contexts, from infrastructure to humanitarian sector to energy and buildings. And we'll look at how we can center Global South conversation and voices in social inclusion. Because, Africa COP, we're in Africa, the Global South, so we need to bring that conversation home. And what then are the positive benefits and maybe some of the challenges of social inclusion, because there can be some. And so we'll dig into that a little bit. As you've heard, the session is supported by the FCDO. Thanks for that, and a whole bunch of other partners in the Climate Compatibility Growth Program. So I think without further ado, and because my small print is really making me struggle, I want to introduce you to our panel. Let's get the discussion going, and if you're online, please ask us questions on Slido. Also in the room, please ask us questions, and you'll be glad to know that there'll be no PowerPoint presentation, just an open, informal discussion about what is really an important topic. So first is Elizabeth Wangeshi Chege. She's the Energy Efficiency and Cooling Specialist at SC4All, the Sustainable Energy for All. Elizabeth is also CEO and founder of WEB Limited, which is a sustainable consultancy with a firm focus of green building legislation in East Africa. So I think she'll be bringing the East African perspective, the green buildings perspective, but also the energy access perspective from SC4All. And then next to her is Samantha Stratton-Short, or Sam. She agreed for me to call her. Sam is the head of strategic initiatives for UNOPS, which focuses on promoting and driving sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure. So expanding this conversation not just to energy, but to the systems and even to infrastructure. UNOPS portfolio really covers a lot of the Global South and includes diverse projects in fragile states and vulnerable communities. And that really helps us center this conversation to the Global South and to this specific COP. And we have Alexander, is he online? Hi, Alexander. Thank you for joining us online. Alexander is a program director of Energizing Development, or EnDev, at GIZ. And he coordinates the engagement across 20 countries and is heading the development of their new thematic intervention areas. So we know GIZ has a lot of coverage and also a lot of coverage in terms of the themes, not just the geographic coverage. So excited to have that perspective and the perspective of the intersection between energy, climate, and I know you do a lot of work with food and farmers as well. So keen to have you and have you here for a discussion. And perhaps Ed will join us, and when he does, we'll introduce our fourth panelist. So let me start with you, Elizabeth. What do we mean when we talk about social inclusion in energy systems? So those, social inclusion, energy systems, those can be very open-ended discussions, right? So what does it mean for you and for the work you do? And feel free to include in there a little bit more about your bio, because I know I've shortened what you're about. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on this panel. So as you said, I am based in Kenya and work regionally as well, and we look at global numbers on the basis of energy as well as buildings and cities. So when we talk about social inclusion, I want to mention that we did go through a session with the high-level champions that we saw the need to define what social inclusion is. And also we had to work on defining metrics. And globally, people believe that social inclusion is very many different things. I think for me today, coming from SE4All as well, is noting that we have over 733 million people without energy access. And when we talk about energy access, it's zero electricity to less than 4 hours access of electricity. So when we look at those numbers, those 733 million people have different levels of needs, different level of wants, and our work is towards accelerating them having that access. I'd like to also add that part of that, especially looking at the building side, is the lack of structure to how we can have them included. We're building the future cities now in Africa, so 80% of the buildings that will exist by 2050 haven't been built. But if you look at the range of standards and regulations of how we are designing our cities, it's very recent that we included in Kenya the universal access opportunity. It's not 100% adopted or implemented, but then we see that we are creating a problem in the future. The other aspect I'd like to bring in as well is that throughout this year, we started looking at why don't we have women at the forefront of conversations, and especially rural women. We launched our Chilling Prospects report that covers cooling, because we saw there's a blind spot in cooling, which is energy intensive. And we saw that there's 1.2 billion people in rural areas who actually don't have access to cooling and also are at high risk. So when you start looking at these different systems, the numbers keep compounding on each other on what we need to do under social inclusion. Today we had the Chilling This Is Cool campaign, and we had youth who put in their challenges, and we had 2 youth from Kenya who won and 1 from Nigeria who won as well. But also on that basis, we saw, as much as we're talking about the youth, we're forgetting there's the children who are below ages of 18 and below that are being forgotten in the conversation. So we might talk about intergenerational, if you're over 35, then we go into youth. Then there's the ones who are going to be youth soon after. So if we talk about urgency, it's a cross-range element that has been taken on board. On the World Green Building side, there's the Africa Manifesto that was launched. And in the manifesto itself, we said there must be pillars that Africa can agree on and have one voice on. With that, we had energy, water, materials, infrastructure, and finance. And the element around social inclusion was cross-cutting. Energy, water, and materials, industry, and finance, infrastructure is one of the things that we've said we need to focus on, because otherwise we'll be leaving other people behind. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Okay, so let me reflect that back. So when you've talked about social inclusion, I hear you saying the people who've been left behind by the energy access by energy access. So you quoted that number, 733 million in sub-Saharan Africa alone. You've talked about women, you've talked about the youth and children, and you've kind of laid out where certain aspects are leaving them behind. So buildings, in the way that we're designing buildings, in the way that people have access to energy, and in the way that we are perhaps thinking together in different sectors, right? What the thing that cuts across that being that really we can't think about one group alone, right? It sounds to me that that's what you're saying. It's about these many groups. And so, Sam, coming to you, do these groups resonate? And in your work, which is a little bit different, a little bit more focused at UNOPS, is this the same idea of social inclusion that you're taking to your work?
Thank you. Yeah, just to say a little bit about UNOPS for those who may not know. So this is United Nations Office of Project Services. We do various things around, we have 5 different service areas: finance, human resources, project management, infrastructure, and procurement. And we are largely the implementation agency for the United Nations. And we are in 80 different countries, probably more than 80, and most of those are in fragile or conflict states, so really challenging contexts that we work in. So when we're looking at the issues of social inclusion, gender empowerment, we're looking across pretty much all sectors. We're extremely inclusive in terms of our infrastructure sectors as well as the people that we're looking at. And recently we've been doing research into trying to unpack what that is, and I totally agree. It's one of the things that we've really been talking about is the intersectionality of all of these different groups as well. So, women and girls being the largest probably, but then it overlaps with numerous different other things. And so, of course, for us, we're looking at people with disabilities. We're looking at people who are internally displaced. And so forth, and then it changes across different infrastructures as well. But so in UNOPS, one of the things that we try to do is, and we have been doing for a few years now, is actually mainstreaming this into our work, so that it's no matter which office it is and what type of project, that this is something that can be applied. And so for a few years, we've had a gender empowerment policy and strategy and way of working, and then we've been upgrading that this year. We have a new strategic plan that incorporates this, and also. We now have, we've deliberately expanded it past just the mention of gender. So it's definitely social inclusion, and that's why we're trying to unpack that, to actually describe that in terms of what happens on the ground. I guess in terms of energy, I mean, I think that some of the real opportunities for social inclusion. I mean, one, it's the obvious one, right? It underpins everything for everybody going forward. It's hard to imagine, how we could do much without it. But then, for marginalized groups or more vulnerable people, it has the potential to really help them as well. So if we're looking at people with disabilities, there are many devices for, whether it's hearing devices, reading devices, wheelchairs, all of these things are need energy some way or another, and but also in terms of safety as well, lighting, now there are apps that can actually, trace, where you are, so that, women and other vulnerable people can feel safe when they're in the streets. So I think that it's a really important part of the sort of infrastructure equation in terms of supporting all of these marginalized groups.
Thanks for that, Sam. So you've talked about mainstreaming social inclusion, right? And you've also talked that you work in fragile and conflict zones. So do you perhaps have an example of how we can mainstream any of these dimensions, right? Pick one, gender, or any of the other dimensions that you've talked about. Because sometimes we hear this word mainstreaming, and in practice, I think there's a lot of us who are not quite sure what that really means. So is there an example you could give us?
Yeah, I can certainly give you an example of a project that we did for Palestinians in Gaza. But I mean, just to demystify the mainstreaming, I mean, for us, it just means it's part of every project, right? So, and what's been important for us is to make sure that when we're signing contracts, that this is, you know, upfront with our partners, that this needs to be included in the work, that we feel that this is essential, and most likely the partners that we work with also see it as important, but they may not have understood at what point it gets, you know, included. So we just try to make that really upfront and transparent, and then we have, you know, we have you know, the checklists and the ways of working through the program to build these in. So, for example, for this one project, the first point of call was for a couple of different ministries to identify a pool of people that they saw were the most needing of energy, and so we were providing solar systems, small-scale solar systems to households, and so they did that. But then we had a vulnerability assessment that was carried out as well to assess the level of vulnerability. And through that, we were able to prioritize like female-headed households, households with people with disabilities, and the end result was that I think about 20% of the project recipients, you know, fell into that category, which is, you know, it's hopefully representative of what we were dealing with.
Thanks. I love those practical examples, just because sometimes we can walk away thinking, yeah, of course I've mainstreamed, but your mainstreaming and someone else's mainstreaming of gender might be so different. So I love those practical examples, and I think people can resonate with some of those things, take them off in their heads, and also think about how they're doing things differently. So thank you for that. Alexander, we haven't forgotten you online. Could you talk to us about what social inclusion in energy systems means for you from your work with EnDev, and how you are working through it in your organization?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And I'm happy that I'm back online. There was a little bit of a disruption, but I'm here now, and I hope you can all hear me. Thanks for inviting me first. I'm representing Energizing Development here today, which, for those of you that don't know the program, basically is a program that's active in 20 countries worldwide, predominantly in Africa, and basically trying to serve energy access to people in need, with a strong focus, I would say, on least developed countries. And as such, I would say the EnDev DNA, so to say, I think is already pretty much geared towards inclusion. I would argue also diversity is a big area of work for us. Currently, what we are doing is in a new iteration, let's say, of future projects that are going to be implemented, we are putting a strong focus on what we call Leave No One Behind, the LNOB approach. And that is, of course, an approach that is definitely taking into account a lot of the elements that we've been, or you've been discussing already now under inclusion. So not only the issue of gender is still very high on our agenda, and I can happily shed some light on that in a couple of minutes. But as you also were mentioning already, handicapped people, poor people, people in rural areas, these are all people that normally not are benefiting from on-grid energy access. So these are the people normally that actually profit from these services, you know, way down the line, I would argue. Still, this is an area that's not easy to tackle, let's be honest here. And we are implementing, of course, in a lot of countries, and addressing the different needs, actually also identifying the different needs is a challenge, I would argue. And also coupling that with a market-driven approach, which we are trying to do with an energizing development, is, of course, also sometimes a challenge. On the other hand, you can see there are a lot of opportunities that if you are sensitized, you're actually able to support. And I think we also, within Energizing Development, currently are in the midst of, let's say, a change process also, trying to put a stronger focus on diversity aspects and aspects of inclusion, on LNOB aspects, to include that basically also in our programming. And people that are, let's say, familiar with these project approaches also know that most of the decisions are made up front in a project design. You are designing a new project in your, let's say, intervention zone. And that's actually where it's important to A, know what you want, but B, also know how to measure it. And that's the second, I think, big, let's say, blind spot is that we often tend to not monitor actually the impacts that we have. And this would also be, let's say, my quote to the audience here and also to other people. If you start designing your project, think about inclusion from the beginning. Think about how you want to actually measure that. And we we just released a new gender strategy also for energizing development with gender action plans and guidelines. I think a very comprehensive set. But as part of that exercise, we actually also came to understand that we think we have a pretty strong positive impact when it comes to gender equality with the work that Energizing Development is doing for health reasons, for economic reasons, for empowerment reasons. But until now, we were actually not able to track that very well, let's say, very detailed. And we're going to change that now. So just goes to say, you also, of course, in the end, need solid data to prove that what you've been trying to achieve, actually, you also were able to achieve with a set of activities or measures. Again, I'm very happy to join the conversation here. This would be my initial, let's say, 2 cents into the discussion. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to a very interesting, inspiring discussion here. More from me later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And I'm so glad you brought the discussion about measuring and about data, because, you know, as the adage goes, you measure what matters. And so understanding what matters at the beginning and then measuring it, but also not just ticking boxes. I think I'd love to take our conversation there at some point, right? Because sometimes when it comes to inclusion, it feels like, you know, we're just ticking a box and saying, you know, 20% of the people reached were women. But like he said, you know, at the end of the project, they found that the impact really wasn't there, or they couldn't verify this impact. So what's missing in that gap? But before we go there, I just want to introduce our final panelist. Ed has just joined us. Ed is the, here I go again with the small print, guys. Give me a minute. Ed is the Regional Director for West Africa at Practical Action. Welcome, Ed. And he's also really passionate, right, about activating markets to work for the underserved segments of society. And that's exactly what we're talking about here, right? That's social inclusion and making sure that markets do work for everybody. And Ed also has a lot of work that is climate focused and also humanitarian focused. So welcome to the conversation. We had just started by really everybody reflecting on what social inclusion in energy systems means for them and their work, and we'd love to hear your perspective.
Thanks, Makena, and I'm glad not to have been left behind. Had a bit of a challenge getting here. Apparently, there's too many similar hotels that sound the same. So I think for us, I work with Practical Action, and we are an international development institution based out of the UK, but a lot of operations within the emerging economies. I'm responsible for West Africa, and most of the thematic areas that we tackle are challenges that people are actually facing at the moment. So one of them is energy access, resilience. So we sort of say resilience that protects, agriculture that works for smallholder farmers, because agriculture is a key, it's a backbone for most African economies. And then a lot of conversations are now going into cities. You know, how do we make our cities fit for populations that are moving into those cities? Because Africa is rapidly, for instance, urbanizing. It's no longer going to be a rural Africa in the next 20 or so years. So for us, our approach to inclusion is, I think I just mentioned to catch a few points that were mentioned by the fellow panelist who's joining remotely, is on having inclusion at the very beginning of designs. We look at problems not as project based, but we look at it as a systemic, kind of a challenge. There's many actors who have a role to play. These actors need to be part of that problem solving. So we tend to. It takes a lot of time sometimes. To be participatory, to be collaborative, because if you want to move fast and someone else wants to be included, there's a bit of challenges there. So that is in our typical programming work. But what's coming out a lot more urgently now is the need to really involve people that are already extremely marginalized, and these include refugees. So we are pioneering work in energy in humanitarian contexts. And even within that context, if you just focus on refugees and you leave out the host communities, you are sure to create conflict. What we do is we involve both the host communities, we involve humanitarian agencies, NGOs, local governments, and the national government to come up with potentially lasting solutions. But our aim is really to demonstrate that these solutions work. Having demonstrated those, then other people we can inspire, support to scale them up. So I think I'll make those as my initial comments and then perhaps pick up the conversation later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. That's a great opener. And I'll just follow up a little bit on something there you said about, and also Alexander mentioned, right, starting from the design process. I think, Sam, you also said that you always have to start from the beginning. And then you said you need to involve the marginalized groups. So how do you do that? How do you involve them in the design of your programs? Can you give us a practical example or a way that you have done that?
Yeah, so I'll give an example of a renewable energy program that we are implementing in Rwanda. So Rwanda is one of the most, I think, welcoming in terms of hosting for communities, because it lets refugees, for instance, have that. It lets them go out of the camp sometimes and get work. That's not possible in some contexts, because most of refugees are normally confined to the camps. So already the enabling environment is there, and the willingness from the government is there. The challenge was that energy, as a lot of community, we were trying to understand what are the challenges that refugees face and the host communities face. So we did a lot of stakeholder engagements. They have key focal people that were contacted, and we realized that some of the challenges involved simple solutions. You could say simple, but yeah, maybe not so simple, like having street lighting within the camps. When you have a street lighting within the camp, it kind of solves a lot of challenges, because a lot of the time, these are the challenges that are being highlighted. People can't leave their homes during the nights because they feel insecure. But the challenge is that if you don't involve them to show them the importance of having the street lights, because we were not the first people to try to do this. There were other people who had tried, but what happened is they actually bust the street lights. So you install it today, 2-3 days later, they take it out, because they're like, no, but why are you putting it? Who told you we need it? But if you involve them, so it's very paradoxical, because from an outsider's perspective, you're trying to help, but from their perspective, they're saying, hey, but what are you trying to do? Who told you we need this kind of stuff? So when they got involved and they actually saw the value of, it took a long time to walk the journey with them, and ultimately the need came from them. We involved the private sector to make the installations, to also help with the maintenance later, so that it's not us going. So we actually tried to look for sustainable business models that can be, we looked at the refugee camps as a marketplace, as opposed to, Because sometimes you'd imagine they don't have resources, but they actually do have resources. So in addition to the street lighting, there are solar lamps, solar home systems that enable them to charge their mobile phones, which is a great need. And clean cooking solutions were then slowly introduced, having delivered the initial energy need that they had, which was security in the streets.
So you're saying people know what they need.
They do.
So that's super interesting to hear from that context, right? Start with the needs that the groups themselves identify with, and then build from there to find solutions, rather than coming with the streetlights to begin with as this top-down approach. That's super interesting, because I think you're starting to hint at some of the challenges that can come in when we're trying, even with all the will we have in this room, to include everybody and to have this kind of social inclusion. There can be some challenges, and you hinted at some of them. So I maybe want to move to you, Elizabeth. What are some of the challenges you have seen as you try to implement the principles of social inclusion, not leave people behind? It's not happening. Maybe it's not happening fast enough. Why?
I think one of the aspects that we actually picked up this year at SE for All, where we were trying to get a common voice to COP27 for women at the forefront, which cut across actually social inclusion, was coming up out of Africa Climate Week. There was also understanding the different levels of knowledge, awareness. So if you're going to have a stakeholder participating, they need to be empowered, first of all. If you're talking about just transition or energy just transition, they need to know what that means first so that they can comment on it. And in most cases, you'll find people shy away from commenting because they feel they're not empowered enough to give comments. So we're only getting partial responses, and we're acting on partial responses, which ultimately will end up in the same situation we're in, if not worse. The other thing as well we noted was now going into Namibia for there was a feminist pre-COP meeting, and we were listening to over 100 women. And the following day we had gender inclusion in the conversation. And most of the women weren't speaking because of cultural issues. So we also noted that we have to create a safe space for people to be able to comment back rather than lump everyone to say, okay, social inclusion, everyone's together, let's have your comments. You actually have to be very sensitive with the nuances of indigenous knowledge on certain aspects, the cultural aspects, and we've seen that as well in some of the work we're doing with, for example, clean cooking, where in Africa we're still using fossil fuel. In some cases, there was clean cooking provided for this community, but they wouldn't use the clean cooking solutions because they said the food tasted different. So it takes you a step back to start considering how are we actually getting into these conversations. It's not academic. There's a lot more that goes into this. So those are some of the aspects that have brought us to a point to say, definitely start with social inclusion, understand the community you're dealing with before you look at sustainable solutions, otherwise they're just going to be intermittent.
Yeah, I love that. I think that we're getting into this discussion about the nuance, because just saying, we had 100 women in a room and therefore that was a social inclusive session, then that's not really, it doesn't capture it, right? It doesn't get into the actual nitty-gritty of what people are concerned with, and giving them the space and the empowerment to be able to talk about their needs, this empowerment to participate. I like that phrase, right? You're empowered to participate, and not just present. Right? So I think that's really important. And you also talked about specific needs. Specific needs, it's coming up a lot. Sam, how about for you in your work? What are some of the challenges that are coming up that are preventing?
Yeah, thanks. I hear so many things that are resonating in terms of things that we run across as well. And, things like, the challenges of refugees. And I think that, we know that, for example, there are just sort of striking statistics for like Bangladesh and Indonesia, where women are 2 to 5 times more likely to die in a tsunami, not because they don't have early warning systems, but because of physiological, social, cultural norms that mean that they don't get the message, or they can't respond to the message in the way that it's delivered, and other issues that we know as people of the built environment, that often the most vulnerable people are living on the worst land, and the ones that get affected by hazards the most, and this cuts across all different vulnerabilities and marginalized groups. The amount of informal settlements and the challenges that people face there, but I think that in terms of the real challenges that we see are, one, it's the time it takes, right? So to actually understand a group, it takes time. But I know that usually in our situation, very, very common in humanitarian situation, there's a huge pressure to come up with a solution as quickly as possible, and even you could say that's coming from donors who don't understand, who aren't sensitive to these things, but actually it's coming from the people themselves too, right? So trying to get that balance, trying to have those discussions, and actually finding where is the sweet spot, I think is a real challenge, and there is no standardization of that, right? I mean that it is all contextual, it is all specific to those groups. So I think those are two big issues. Is just the specificity of every group that you deal with, and the time it takes to understand that and actually understand them and what they need.
Yeah, I mean that's it, right? It takes time, and everything is so specific because no two groups' needs are the same, let alone if you include other contexts like geography and all these other dimensions. And that's really pointing to one of the questions that's being asked here, which is that, and thank you so much for the Slido questions, the audience. Social inclusion is multidimensional, but are there measures that can improve social inclusion across all dimensions? Right? I'm hearing you maybe say there isn't a one-size-fits-all. And you can answer, Sam, or anyone else.
For that question, I'd like to point to environmental impact assessments. So in some countries they're carried out, in some they implemented, some they're not carried out. So the environmental impact assessments give opportunity for that stakeholder engagement. And stakeholder engagement can take 6 months, 1 year, or even more. And there's, depending on the magnitude of projects or development projects, they need to take longer, and they need to ensure that they cover the population of a certain area. So we've seen a lot of projects that would stall if it's a development project, if not enough people are actually brought up to the table, and also depending on what the comments are. It's kind of, you have to convince the community or change the project to suit. So where we see a risk is when we don't bring the stakeholders on board. With that, especially in the built environment side, there's no open source data. It's like everyone has to go and do their own environmental impact assessments and bring stakeholders on board and have social inclusion. There's a lot of inefficiency in that, especially if we're going to, if there's urgency to include the people in a certain area. So I think also there's an element of the data being open source and being able to share so that, in this area in 2022, this is what we have, and we can build on each other's data rather than have our data sets, move on with the development, then the next person comes, does the same thing, instead of being efficient across it.
So maybe one solution is a standardized way to add inclusion into the dialogue, like the environmental impact assessment and the consultation, and then sort of the sharing of data. But I wondered, is that still, is that a one approach that can cover all dimensions? I think this is the crux of the question here. I think someone is trying to really get to the point of, if there's all this specificity, what can we do right, that could potentially cut across. Is that even possible, or is that a fool's errand and we really need to be always specific in our approach? And Alexander, as well, feel free to add to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was just thinking, I mean, there's probably no kind of, one size fits all solution to that question, the way that it was asked. But I think it would be very helpful also for all of us to turn the question a little bit around and say, when we talk about inclusion or diversity, are we talking about a problem or are we talking about a solution? And often people think this is a problem that we need to address actually. And I think the example that my colleague here from Practical Action already described was a very good one. We tend to think that in refugee camps, all people are poor. They can't purchase anything at all, and that's wrong. It's actually a market. It's a small market, but still, it's a vibrant economy. It's a society there, and so if you enter that market, that geographic area, with that mindset in mind, I think it actually helps you to come up with solutions. And so it's not only a problem. In every problem, actually, you have a solution. There is something that often you can offer. And if you are changing the mindset more towards saying diversity is something, that a diverse set of cultural norms, of the different stakeholders that you have on board, different people, different society groups, but all that together basically creates a diverse setup of opportunities that you actually can use for your society to grow, for your project to be successful and efficient. And I think that matters, changing the mindset. And then you will, I think, also suddenly realize that you do have a lot of people that have a lot in common actually with you or your project or the target that you actually want to achieve. And that will definitely help you achieving it. And so you can, let's say, zoom in on very small groups of people, a project team, for example, and look at the benefits that you basically have from different people with different backgrounds actually joining in, basically working towards a unified goal. And we are also trying to do that, of course, in our background on various levels, be that within the project teams on the ground, be that within the broader company of GIZ, where cooperate in diversity, that's how we call it, is one of the 4 key pillars of actually our cultural understanding of how we want to work together. And so that just goes to say, I think maybe one solution could be, one size fits all solution could actually be to say, where's the opportunity in basically tackling diversity or LNOB, whatever you want to call it? Where's the opportunity, and what can we basically change? And there's, I think, a lot of opportunities actually that basically we can grasp and move forward.
So, I mean, to take your advice, Alexander, and let's shift this conversation, right, into the opportunity, but also let's bring it back to energy systems. I'm going to stay with you and ask, what then is the opportunity that you think there is, or you've seen in your work, of social inclusion in the energy access or in the energy access sector? I know that's where you're working, but really generally in energy systems. Maybe one key opportunity that you found, or an example of where that has been an added advantage to really consider inclusion. Yeah,
I mean, in terms of providing energy access, and be that on-grid access or off-grid access, I think you really have a lot of very, very, very positive and also transformative effects actually. So I think the most quoted, let's say, group of people, I would say, are of course women in that respect. But I think it goes beyond that. It also goes to children. It also goes to handicapped people. It goes to poor people, to refugees. If you're able to provide energy access, you can definitely increase the lifespan of people basically, because you have less hazardous smoke basically in-house if it's clean cooking, for example. There's educational benefits, and there are also economic benefits, because what we of course also are specialized on is to promote very small businesses, so 1 or 2 woman shows, so to say, that people actually are able to use the energy in a productive manner, and that really has life-changing effects across the board, I would argue. And that's really I think one of the key aspects that we are trying to support people and basically, catering for their own needs towards the end of the day. That's kind of the sustainability approach. That's also part of the energizing development DNA. So I could, of course, continue this for 10 more minutes, but I think I tried to address the question that you are raising here. But if there are any other questions, please feel free to ask again.
Thank you. Yeah, so you've given us the opportunities that exist for impact, right? Mm-hmm. And then how that impact can flow from, in your example, women who are typically socially excluded and flow to the community. And I think that's really interesting. I want to encourage anyone in the room who has a question to also ask it as we continue. If you raise your hand, then we can always pass the mic. Okay. There's already one question in the room, and then I'll go back to Slido. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks for the very interesting discussion. Thank you. Yeah, I want to go back to what Elizabeth mentioned about the safe space. So, especially for the perspective of a girl child. So in many communities, rural communities, I'm from Nigeria. And so in northern Nigeria, you see that the father makes a lot of decisions for the family. And so when it comes to especially, I understand maybe for the wife, a woman, maybe she can be smart about how to get involved in these discussions or find a way to, participate, right? But for the girl child that wants to get education, she needs maybe solar lamps to be able to study. There's so many needs for her, right? How do you practically create a space for her to be able to, speak up, despite, having this fear of the father and being, subject to, his decisions about her life? Yeah.
So a question there about how to create the spaces for people to speak up. Just pause, we'll take one more and then respond to all of them together.
Thank you. I'm just curious if so really appreciate the comments about open data and information sharing. I wonder if there is, or perhaps there would be value in creating a platform so that the increasing players that are there can upload stories, case studies, and other things. And maybe it would be useful to think about how that might be structured and accessible. Thank you.
So who wants to respond first?
Can I take up the first one on creating spaces? One of the things that we are keen on as practical action is integration of the voices of the communities where we work. And that is a very good example of power dynamics, because let's be honest, when we talk about inclusion, we're talking about power dynamics. It could be a girl child, or it could be a woman who can earn her money, but she's not culturally allowed to spend it the way she wants, which can be baffling sometimes if you're not within that context. We're talking about behavior change, for instance, in a cultural context. So these are very difficult conversations. And I think we have to be honest about things, that if you want to talk about inclusion, you have to go into uncomfortable situations. That's one thing. The other thing I think I find useful is to, if I was to start a program in the sense that I want to provide lanterns to help women study or girls study, and then the man does not know about it, you only involve girls and women, and then you provide the lamp to the household, what do you think is going to happen? You can't sell the lamp, but at the end of the day, they won't use it. Maybe they won't use it, or number two, you'll create additional problems. So when you talk about inclusion, I think you need to look at it from a wider perspective. Maybe get men into, one thing I've seen work really well is get a champion. They call them gender champions. So someone who's doing something differently, and they do exist. Maybe, the first person to buy a bike in the community, why did they get the bike when everyone else was walking? Or someone else who has a car and they like to do some entrepreneurial. These are influential people in the community. If you can tap into these people, to try to start convincing pockets of others who haven't really gotten the context yet. That is an excellent way of introducing them. And then later on, maybe you can have, so you have separate sessions with, say, men, and then you have separate sessions with women. At some point, you start to find a way to integrate it. It takes time, it's difficult, but I think it's possible, and it's contextual. I wanted to chip in on the second question, but now my book has just fallen.
We can come back.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll add to what you were actually saying, which is great. I think on the basis of the safe space, and also coming from an organizational level, is to work with the locals rather than getting the numbers online and using those numbers. It's understanding that context. It makes it easier to work with someone from the community. In a lot of our projects, you'll find those community champions, but people who work in that community being part of the program rather than being studied in the program. The other aspect as well, transitioning to the open data source, definitely a great opportunity for a platform where you found data, for example, in the camps, that you could share with organizations that are looking at that area. Then we learn from each other instead of having another organization. If you're doing solar lamps and someone else, for example, is doing the clean fuels, comes in and starts doing the same process, etc., then we're being inefficient. So when we're talking about energy systems, I think there's a level of efficiency that can actually be shared. But beyond the two questions, I think the great opportunities there's additional benefits that sometimes are not documented with social inclusion. And those additional benefits, we don't go back to get the information, to get the additional benefits. So you could say, yes, we put the solar lamps, everyone is secure, they're studying a little bit more, but then it's understanding those family contexts to get those additional benefits that can support the programs.
Yeah, thank you for that. So yes, there is a need for this, a data sharing platform or a platform to share information about social inclusion. Does anybody know if one exists, or is it about creating a new space? I know you wanted to comment on that second point on data.
Yeah. Open data. So I think it depends. A lot of what is shared is success stories. I'm always curious to see, can we share non-successful stories maybe, so that people know what didn't work really well? That I think in my organization as well, a lot of people might disagree. But I think it's useful so that people don't make the same mistakes we're making. I don't think we have enough time to do some of this stuff that we're doing. The climate impacts are happening, and they're happening really fast. We have to find ways and be uncomfortable to sort of try to find unconventional partnerships, if you like. At Practical Action, for instance, we're part of an alliance of many partners. Some you can consider competitors, but we share a similar platform that shares information on resilience, because we work in resilience as well, flood resilience, so that it's not energy based, but yeah, flooding could affect energy systems if you like. But I also think what we do a lot is be in practitioner groups, where I think that we're already doing really well. Is it open? That's something that we might need to explore.
Thank you for that. Let me now turn to you, Sam. There's some questions here tagged UNOPS, so I'll bundle them together. So one question is, how do we design protection programs for vulnerable people without increasing dependency, which can inadvertently, come up from such systems, right? And entrenching what is really their vulnerability. How do we do that? How do we balance designing the right solutions, not creating dependency, and not making worse the vulnerabilities that have made people excluded in the first place? And then, as you answered that, I think there's a UNOPS, very specific UNOPS one here. Sorry, just go ahead while I work on this.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I primarily come from the infrastructure space, so specifically designing programs for protection is not necessarily something that I could speak to specifically, but I can say from a very physical perspective in terms of creating a safe space, which we were talking about. We have an example of police facilities that we were doing in Afghanistan, and so in terms of mainstreaming gender empowerment into this into the design and into the project. There were consultations were carried out, and many of the things are things you would expect. That there needs to be toilets for women and facilities for women. But I think one of the interesting things that came out was that that they actually needed a specific room for women to come in to speak to police officers. So they would have issues, whether it's gender violence or pretty much anything, and they weren't coming and they couldn't speak to the police because they had to be in a separate room according to their custom. So the simple addition of a room just for them is empowering, and it's amazing how something so simple could actually create a bigger change, I think.
I love that. I love the idea of sometimes the solutions can be so simple, but sometimes we rush into complexity and looking for the high-tech solution. So before we go back to the audience, I want to come back to this idea we've had here about the different social dimensions. We need to include people. Alexander, if I can come to you, what are some of the voices you think are missing from this dialogue and from our attempts at social inclusion, and how do we bring them in?
Yeah, I very much like the first question from the audience with the illustrative example, of the girl and the father, and the girl, wanting to pursue her education, maybe being afraid of the father, because I think what we often are missing, and that's also one of the lessons I would argue that we, in our internal, very comprehensive gender process that we went through, came up with, is that in discussing these aspects, and so I'm focusing in on gender now to make it a little bit, let's say, more clear maybe, is that we should not forget to also include the man in this whole discussion, and because let's be honest, in a lot of circumstances still, we're talking about cultural norms, hard to change them over time. It really takes time. So in a lot of circumstances, the man will still be the decision maker, be it in the household saying, we are buying a new stove or we are buying something else for the money, yeah, and so forth. And so I really like the example that was brought forward here, because it means that we really need to bring everyone to the table. And in this case, also the men, and convincing them. And here again, I think it's important to basically underline the benefits that you have of inclusion. So in this example, I mean, if the girl is able to study at home, also after darkness falls, because now there is light in the house, let's say, then that's of course also good for the father downstream, because she will most likely get a better paid job if she has a good education, right? And so who's going to pay for the pension of the father down the line? So there are a lot of good arguments, let's say, to educate people, but generally, let's say, to elevate also those people that until now have been rather excluded in a society, let's say. But that is of course a difficult discussion. But still, I think it's important that we also are trying to address, so to say, the elephant in the room. In this case would be the men, because they are in most of the cases still the ones who are wielding the power, and who basically also need to play along. If we don't get to come to that discussion, basically it's going to be hard to implement a change. I'm not saying that all men are bad, but this is just the situation that we often face. It is this way. And that is also for us now, of course, in designing, let's say, approaches and solutions. It's also, I think, very important to keep that in mind, that you need to have basically all the relevant stakeholders, so to say, on the table. And then actually you have a lot of, I think, good success stories that you can build upon. And I very much liked what some of the panelists here said before. It's of course the community engagement. You will need to identify local champions, so to say, outspoken people, women that have been very successful that can inspire also other women, other girls to follow suit. I think that is really very important to have these champions also on the local, regional level that basically are living already what the others are striving for, and basically, kind of being the real life example of that this change actually can happen, and it's possible basically to achieve it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexander. So you talked about men, and by extension, I guess whoever is traditionally has been included and is still wielding some of the power for the action that needs to happen, and make sure that we're bringing them into the dialogue. I wonder if my panelists in the room agree, or do you think there are any other voices that are not really being heard and really focusing on energy systems, energy infrastructure planning? Who are we not hearing from in that conversation? Or do you agree with Alexander, it's just the men?
Well, I agree. No, it's not just men, but I think there's other actors that I think are key to add to the conversations, and that could involve, that for me involves government, local government, and cascading. It goes up, so it's not cascading; it's going up to national government. Because I think if you're looking at it as a system, then if you identify a solution and the community themselves adopt that solution, that approach, then it's easy to influence the local government. You get a host of that, then easily it becomes a policy document or a guideline that someone else can follow. Because I think in the end, it's all that we do should help to build that systemic change, and that systemic change comes from I think policies are super powerful in terms of scaling up solutions.
Okay, so local government, another voice. What did you want to say, Lizzie?
I wanted to bring in the aspect of health and well-being, and also there's been a lot of discussion around mental health, especially with the climate crisis and with the pandemic. So I think the pandemic was one thing that taught us that we are not doing the social inclusion so well, and also with the element of if we bring in electricity access, even if vaccines were flown from other countries to some countries in Africa, they couldn't be chilled. So it's a compounding issue that we need to bring social inclusion at the center of growth. If we're talking about resilient growth or sustainable growth, social inclusion should be at the center of it. Otherwise, we'll be solving one issue and creating another issue somewhere else. That the element of mental health and where people are and the health status really came to the center of how we were trying to resolve the COVID issue as well.
Okay, so here you're bringing in another dimension of inclusion, right? Another thing we need to consider, right? I'm putting it in the same place as gender, youth, disability, and you're bringing in another aspect of health. Sam, did you want to say anything about what voices are missing from the dialogue, or?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about the discussion of social inclusion is, for example, there are some groups that believe that if we focus on women, then we will capture so many other missing voices. And I think that's a really interesting one because while you can see how that works in many societies in terms of, power, about, who's helping and who's responsible for these things, you still have to say, well, it's got to go beyond that, right? Because one, it puts too much burden on the woman again, and also it's not giving a voice to the people that actually need to have their needs heard. So I think there are actually a lot of voices that are missing. And in a report that we're launching tomorrow, we really tried to go into about 9 different marginalized groups to understand what their needs were in terms of different infrastructure and specific needs around energy and related to climate change as well. But really trying to bring out the sort of their individual groups' needs, which then comes back to the, I can't say the word, but the the very specificness, that was what I was going for, of all the different groups and how you then bring them back together again.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I'm looking forward to reading this report because having to delineate those dimensions means at least those are the voices that we have included, right? And that you've looked at them in specific detail, which is really important. I mean, we've been talking about nuance a lot in this panel. So thanks for bringing that up. We are at a climate, conference, so maybe we should bring this round back to climate. Maybe I can start with you, Alexander, out there online. What parts of society do you think are vulnerable in terms of the energy systems and how that relates to the climate changing? And for these that are vulnerable, what is there to lose, and then what can we do about it when we're talking about social inclusion?
Yeah, I think this is of course honestly really the sad situation, that the people who will be mostly affected by climate change at the same time also are the ones that have least resources actually to tackle climate change. So in other words, it will be poor people, be it in cities or in rural areas, that will be mostly affected by climate change. And at the same time, there's actually not a lot that they actually can do about it, right? So they predominantly will be in a situation where they are faced with this overlapping crisis, I think, that we currently see. So it's climate change. With that comes either drought or increased floods. And then, of course, the people that don't have a lot of income will find it very challenging to actually serve the most basic needs, let's put it this way, let alone, striving for any bigger targets in their life. And I think that's really something where, basically our energy access work is trying to make a difference in elevating people to higher income levels, and also to make them more resilient. Let's say farmers who are able to harvest more crops because, for example, of solar irrigation that we are supporting, would be in a different position to withstand the changes of climate change. I'm not saying this is the one-size-fits-all solution. It's of course not, but it will definitely help also to stabilize societies. I think if you look at it from a very, let's say, big picture perspective, we will be faced with very grave challenges in societies in different countries and nations in the years to come if we are not trying to tackle upfront not only mitigation but adaptation. And adaptation, I think, generally is kind of the blind spot in the whole climate debate until now. I think it's changing a bit now. I mean, you're closer to the discussion currently than I am, but also I think in our work in the past, we've been focusing a lot on the mitigation aspects that, of course, you always can argue for and that still are important. But I think especially if you look at the ratio of emission reductions that you can achieve versus how much people are affected in the countries that we are working in, adaptation actually should be the higher priority in the engagement. And again, there's a lot of work still to be done, I think, also on our end.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, it goes into something that I was going to ask: how should we behave differently now that we understand who's most vulnerable? And I think that's a really important point you've put forward there about the fact that we need to be thinking more about adaptation when we are talking about social inclusion, because really the people who are most excluded are also the people who are most likely to suffer, and they need that adaptation financing and adaptation and resilience building sort of now. I don't know if any of the other panelists wants to react to this. How do we change the way we're doing things, given that that's where we are with social inclusion and how the most vulnerable are more likely to be affected? How do we change what we're doing in the energy access space with that reality in mind?
Sorry. Sure. I think to add to it, for myself and where we come from, when we talk about SDG 7, for example, which is not on track, there's SDG 7.1, which is energy access, which gets a lot of airwave. That's good. Then quickly on the commercial aspect, people go to renewable energy and opportunities around that. But we forget there's 7.3, energy efficiency. So I think even before we start looking at the element of what can we change with the women. It's with everyone, and hence the social inclusion element, that you have a point where there's an emotional aspect on behavior, on energy efficiency, where those who have can actually do better. We can do better with energy efficiency that allows inclusion of all those who are marginalized to have resources that actually exist as we work towards improving and accelerating access. I wanted to point that out and also bring in the aspect that if we're doing things different, we have to start immediately on a common level, because we can all go and do things differently and then come back to COP28 and we'd have different metrics. So I think that's something that's definitely worthwhile doing. Thank you.
Okay, so do things together and not different together. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I would say that if we're going to talk about doing things differently, one of the things that will be really helpful, so that there's sort of two aspects to this. One is strategic planning, because we can do so much with climate change if we actually look at the bigger picture, and I think we can do a lot more in terms of the vulnerabilities when we can see the bigger picture. Then when we're already, a project has been selected or a community has been selected, and then you're trying to address the issue. So I think that holistic thinking can really be helpful. On the other hand, one of the biggest challenges about strategic planning is getting the voices heard, right? Because this is now becoming more abstract. It's harder to, it's covering a lot more people. Right. So there are a lot of challenges. So I think you still have to have a very localized approach at the same time, and the value of decentralized systems, energy systems included, is really, I think, gaining more, credibility and things, which it didn't a while ago. Everything had to be centralized. That was the only system that worked. But now I think the understanding of how it can really empower communities to actually, make the decision of what they want, own it, and run it themselves. So I think that there's, both those scales are really key to the future.
That's super. So start by strategic planning, but also understand that you might lose some detail if you only focus on strategic planning, and you also have to bring in the voices from the beginning. We are almost at time, but Ed, you wanted to say something?
I'll just add one thing to reinforce what you said, which is, you could be strategic, but I think as you involve people, there's some new information that might come in and you might need to adapt your programming or your work. So I think we need to think about flexibilities in a way that actually takes in new information and new ideas, so that you're not stuck to certain metrics. Of course, you must have a goal, but you need to find a way to improve these systems. And lastly, is also to reinforce productive use of energy. I think a lot of focus has been on energy access, having lighting, cooking solutions for use. That is good, but I think if you can help people to actually have more money, that's even better, because you're helping them to adapt it to any vulnerabilities that might come. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Ed ending us there on flexibility. I think that's something we get baked into a lot, and we don't always have that. We only have 2 minutes left. I want to say thank you to my panelists for an engaging discussion. I also want to say thank you to FCDO and also the Climate Compatibility Group that put this together, especially Alicia and Steffi. And with that, I want to hand back over to the CCG group. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Alexandra Online.